So welcome everybody. I'm Kevin Reuther. I'm the Chief Legal Officer at MCEA. And with me today are Evan Mulholland, our Supervising Attorney, and Ellen Anderson, the Director of our Climate Program. Thank you guys for being here. Hi, Evan.
Hey, Kevin.
Hi, Ellen.
Hi, good to be here.
We're all coming to you from our various homes in St. Paul and Minneapolis. And we're gathered to talk about Evan's argument before the Minnesota Supreme Court that he just completed this morning. And we want to answer any questions that you have about the argument or about the case. Thank you very much for joining us. And thank you for your support of MCEA. We invited our donors to this webinar, and so I know that you're one of those donors, and it's your support that makes this work happen. So we're very grateful for that and want to make sure that we thank you for it. So Evan, great job this morning. I don't know, we can't do a show of hands in this forum, so I'm not sure how many people got to see it, but I'm guessing that a few logged on, and I was definitely watching. You were awesome. So congratulations. How does it feel?
Thank you, Kevin. It feels really good to be done with that. I think that our brief went in really well, and I think the argument was pretty good. It sounded like at least some of the justices really understood our point.
Yeah.
So it feels really good to have that. Honestly, I was a little nervous with the tech. I've never argued remotely like that. I've argued many times before appellate panels and courts like that, but it's always in person. You have your notes, you're there with the judges. And I was worried about the tech. I was worried about like coming through and hearing and getting disconnected. All of those things were just made me nervous setting up for this.
Well, are you having that kind of post-hearing, after the adrenaline rush, relaxed feeling now?
I do feel pretty good. Of course, our next argument before the Supreme Court's in 1 month, so we got to start getting ready for the next one on Polymat.
Well, we'll give you a week at least of relaxation before you have to start. So as I said, I think a lot of people maybe watched the argument or they're familiar with this case. Of course, we're talking about the NTEC case, the natural gas proposal for Minnesota Power in Superior, but maybe you can just give us, the thumbnail sketch of what the case is about.
Sure,
We're on the same page.
So MCA has been working on this case for about 5 years. And the real question that was before the Public Utilities Commission is, should Minnesota Power be allowed to add a new power plant, a new gas-fired power plant to its generation mix? Minnesota Power is going to be constructing and operating the plant, even though it's in Wisconsin, although only 2 miles from Minnesota, right across from Park Point on the Superior side of the harbor, along with all the other industrial facilities over there. And the question before the Supreme Court was, can the PUC approve this without doing environmental review under our MEPA law, the Minnesota Environmental Policy Act? Our position was that, yeah, when you have a government action that's going to result in a new power plant being built by a utility, it doesn't really matter where it's going to be if the effects are going to hit Minnesota. And Minnesota Power and the PUC obviously argued the other side, that no, we can skip MEPA.
And we won the case below at the Court of Appeals.
We did. We prevailed at the Court of Appeals. The Court of Appeals agreed with our position, and the Supreme Court took this case. They have discretion to take cases, and they take about 10% of cases in this category. And yeah, we're hoping that they affirm the Court of Appeals decision.
Yeah. Okay. Good. So Ellen, I have a question for you, but before I get to there, I just want to remind people that we're here to answer your questions. And I failed to point out that there's the little Q&A bubble at the bottom of your screen. So if you hover over the webinar screen, you should get a little bubble right in the middle that says Q&A. If you click on that, you'll be able to type your question in there. And I'll put your questions to Evan and Ellen if you have them. So make sure that you're typing your questions in. So Ellen, what I was wondering is if you could talk to us a little bit about MCEA's interest in this case. You're obviously our new climate program director. This fits within your program area. Why is MCEA, working on natural gas plant in Superior?
That's a great question, Kevin, and it really does fit into our bigger picture thinking about how to tackle climate change in Minnesota in particular, but in the surrounding areas and how it affects Minnesota. So I would start by saying that we're in a pivotal, really critical time when it comes to climate change action. The good news is that lots of coal plants are being retired in Minnesota and around the country. And that is reducing carbon emissions dramatically and will continue to do so. However, what we found is that many utility companies, as they reduce coal plants, they then want to replace them with natural gas plants. And what's called natural gas is a fossil fuel, just like coal is. It emits greenhouse gas emissions, and it also can, during its processing and travel, et cetera, shipping, pipeline process, et cetera, and through fracking, it can release methane and other gases. So methane is a greenhouse gas emission that's far more harmful to the atmosphere in terms of its impact on climate change than carbon dioxide is even, so that it's a really important problem. Now, so what we're doing is trying to look at the development of new fossil fuel infrastructure generally, and to say, just as a principle, it doesn't make any sense in 2020 to be adding new fossil fuel generating plants, whether they're coal-based or gas-based. If they are fossil fuel plants, when you build these plants, they're going to be around for 40 or 50 years. And so we are in a point where the top scientists of the world agree that we have to be at net zero emissions by the mid-century. That's only 30 years from now. And so if we keep building these new plants, we lock in this infrastructure, we lock in the use of these fossil fuels, and we also create a lot of risk for the customers who have to pay for all of this, because, you know, right now, wind and solar and battery storage and other modern technologies combined are out competing fossil fuels. And so even if they're not today in every situation competitive, cost competitive, they will be in a matter of a decade or so. And so what that means is that if we let these plants go forward universally, then we're locking ourselves into more fossil fuel pollution, more climate change impacts, and more risk to ratepayers having to spend more money than they would if we just converted to clean energy as an alternative. So that's part of our bigger strategy, is let's avoid these new fossil fuel generating plants from being built.
That's such an interesting point about the, locking in the risks, because when you think about it, I think you said that the plant will be around for 40 to 50 years. Basically what that means is that, young kids or people that aren't even born yet are going to end up paying for this plant and this decision. And they're probably going to be paying a lot more than they would have to for some other cheaper type of generation 40 years from now.
Absolutely, and that's exactly what's happened to coal plants, is that they're getting economically just not viable. They just can't survive in today's market, and wind and solar are just getting cheaper every year. And so we need to, let's put our bet on the future instead of on the past. It's just a disaster for the climate and for people's pocketbooks.
So one of the topics, Evan, during the oral argument was related to that. I can't remember the justice who asked it, but there was a question kind of suggesting that the PUC had really already studied the greenhouse gas emissions from NTEC, from this proposed natural gas plant. And in fact, the PUC's attorney kind of went on and on about how the externality values have been calculated and all that kind of stuff. What did you think of that point, and how does that relate to your argument about the need to do environmental review?
Yeah, I expected that argument. We had prepared extensively for this with the team, so I was waiting for that argument. And our response was that, well, first, the law applies. You've got to do what the law says. It's a procedural law that allows the public to be involved in the environmental review, to comment and read what the impacts are going to be. And I noted to the court that the actual projected amount of carbon dioxide emissions from the plant is still a trade secret. And the reason for that, The reason for that,
I'm noting that there's a question about that, so good that you're talking about it.
yeah, the reason for that is that the company makes projections on how much they're going to run the plant, you know, in different conditions, different seasons, different times of day. And they say that that's a secret because it's release financial information. So there's no way to know right now what, I mean, we know the maximum, like if you ran it, you know, every minute of every day for a year, you'd know roughly what it would be, but you don't know what the actual impact is going to be because they have claimed it's secret. And on top of that, we haven't really looked at the impacts on the traditional pollutants that come from a power plant, like nitrous oxides and particulate and other pollutants that are from the plant that would reach Minnesota via air and water. So those are things that we haven't looked at yet.
So related to that trade secret issue, we have a question asking whether MEPA review is the only way that the public would be able to find out what the projected CO2 emissions are.
Until it's built and running, I believe that's the case. I mean, once it's running, they'll be operating under a federal permit, a Clean Air Act permit, and they'll have to report what their emissions are. But that's years from now.
I suppose we can make some estimates, right? We know how many megawatts the plant is being built.
Well, we know how big it is, and we also, well, we know because we signed the NDA what the Minnesota Power is projecting about how often they'll run it.
Yeah. Okay. Question here about the prospects. What do you think the odds are for a positive decision?
I'm a little too close, Kevin. I may kick that one back to you, but I would note that several of the justices appeared to understand the argument and they seem supportive of our argument.
Yeah.
I don't know. What do you think, Kevin?
What was your reaction, Ellen?
You know, I think there's a assumption in my mind, which may or may not be accurate based on sort of all court decisions, all Supreme Court decisions, but you know, coming on appeal from the Court of Appeals is helpful. So you have already won once in front of a court. So that's a really good sign. And, you know, I feel cautiously optimistic about this, honestly, because I think we have a strong case and it's about environmental review and we have a really strong law on that in Minnesota and we're just trying to exercise that environmental protection law.
Great. Yeah, I was pleased with the questions, I have to say. You know, it's always a little bit iffy to go out on the ledge and make a prediction because you just don't know. But I felt that at least 3 of the justices were asking pretty favorable questions to our side. And it's a 7-member court, so we need 4 votes. But yeah, we'll see what happens there. Another question here. Xcel is planning a gas plant in Becker. Rochester Public Utilities may propose a large gas plant for 2030 replacement of SIMPA, replacement of the Sherco unit, I'm thinking. What help can you provide? Those are big questions that we're working on. Ellen, maybe you want to talk about the Becker gas plant and the Xcel IRP?
Absolutely. Yeah, and that's a great question because, as I mentioned, you know, we're looking at all the different proposals for new fossil fuel infrastructure, and big gas plants being number one. And so we are actively very engaged in Xcel's IRP, their integrated resource plan that's in front of the Public Utilities Commission right now, and it's their 15-year plan. And I have to say first, you know, Xcel has great climate targets, which we are very supportive of. You know, they want to get to be carbon free pretty quickly, which is great. But at the same time, when they are in the process of retiring their last coal plant, which is great, they want to substitute a new natural gas fossil fuel plant at Becker in the same location, basically. So it's essentially seen as a replacement. And so we are working with a number of clean energy organizations with really great groups that in Minnesota that have a lot of technical expertise and knowledge, and we're representing them at the Public Utilities Commission on this matter. And we're spending a lot of time with our modeling experts who are really examining very, very deeply all the data that we can get, because as Evan was talking about, we can sign NDAs or non-disclosure agreements so that we can look at trade secret information and find out exactly what data Excel relied upon, and make our case that we really don't think that we need this big new fossil fuel plant in Becker, that we really don't need it to have a reliable electricity system, and it would be more expensive to go forward with this and its big pipeline that would be attached to it. And so we're working on that. These are kind of long slogs, these integrated resource plan proposals. And so this will be heard, the first kind of pleadings at the Public Utilities Commission is not till January of 2021. So we're getting ready for that.
Great, thanks. Another question here, more about the argument from this morning. It seemed like there was a difference of opinion about whether the project could go forward without the PUC's approval. And I heard that as well, that Minnesota Power was essentially saying, well, this can be built anyway. The PUC kind of was implying that as well. And then you stood up, Evan, and you said that that was not accurate. So maybe you can explain to folks what the record actually says about that issue and why it's important.
Well, I'll say why it's important first. If it were the case that Minnesota Power could just go ahead and build this without, regardless of what the PUC did, it sort of, I don't know, it makes the whole proceeding before the PUC seem a bit irrelevant. I think that because the fact that they spent so much time on it, and we all spent so much time on it, supports the idea that it was necessary for Minnesota Power to have this approvals before it could go build the power plant in Wisconsin. And what they're actually saying is that they formed a subsidiary, a Wisconsin company, a subsidiary of Minnesota Power, to actually hold the ownership of the property and the plant over in Wisconsin, because Wisconsin has this law that says only Wisconsin-based companies can own power plants in Wisconsin. So Minnesota Power had to create South Shore, which is this Wisconsin affiliate subsidiary, to hold it. But it was really a pass-through company, that Minnesota Power would be taking all the responsibility and all the obligations that South Shore had. And it was never decided definitively by the PUC what would happen if they had denied their approval. The commissioners spoke, and some of the attorneys spoke about how this was important. They actually said that this was key. These approvals were key for this to get built. But Minnesota Power and the PUC argued today that they weren't necessary, that Minnesota Power, through its Wisconsin affiliate, could go ahead regardless. And there just wasn't any evidence that that was the case. And that was a hard point, I think, for the case.
Yeah.
I think I heard you say, Evan, though, that there was evidence that the plant wouldn't go forward if Minnesota Power was not bankrolling it, basically. So that's a key factor, that there is evidence on that.
There is, yes. That was part of what that, I mean, that's why Minnesota Power, the utility, was involved in our estimation.
Yeah, it's kind of the difference between a theoretical could, like, well, yes, this could be built, right? Dairyland could go forward with it and without Minnesota Power, but would it? No, right?
Right.
So that was sort of a difficult one. Here's a question about pollution. While pollution was only mentioned tangentially, will the judges be considering this?
I don't know. I know that at the Court of Appeals, they seemed very concerned with having Minnesotans protected by MEPA, at least having the pollution impacts to Minnesota reviewed. And I'm hopeful that the Supreme Court will see it the same way.
Yeah. How about this one for you, Ellen, as a former PUC commissioner? Someone suggests that the PUC sounds like it's on the side of the companies, not the people or the environment. Is that often the case?
Wow, that's a loaded question. Yeah. I mean, it certainly might seem that way at times. I think we have a good set of commissioners on the commission. They're really excellent and thoughtful and try to do their best, I think. They have to follow the laws. And so not to sort of, pass the blame or the responsibility on, but they are, by law, they're set up to implement and interpret Minnesota's energy laws. And if they feel like they don't have the authority to vote against something under Minnesota law, then they can't do it and they won't do it. And they're very conscientious about following that. And if they don't do it, they'll get sued, right? So, and so there is that sort of balance between the legislation and the commission action. And sometimes it goes back and forth, where there are some modifications. There's ways that we could fix the legislative standards for the commission so that they could have more authority on climate change related decisions. I think we have some really great laws in place, but we could have better ones. And that's one place where we could help shape that. And I think public participation is critically important in the PUC proceedings, and everybody can participate in different ways and should as much as possible.
Yeah, thanks. Another question here about the argument. There was a lot of discussion about but for and causation, Evan, and wondering if you could explain that sort of in layman's terms. What's the issue? What does but for mean? Why is that important?
So this gets into a lot of legal theory, and there are lots of law review articles written about this, some of which I've read in preparation for this. But the basic idea is that something that's a but-for cause means that if it had not happened, the effect would not have happened. So, a but-for cause of a car accident would be, me driving through the red light. Like, if I hadn't driven through the red light, I wouldn't have hit the car in front of me. There wouldn't have been an accident. But sometimes those causes are not enough for liability to attach in a tort. I think I'm getting too far afield. So really, what we're talking about here in the context of environmental review is there enough of a connection between the government approval and the thing that happened in the world?
So, like,
that's really the question.
Is the power plant resulting from this approval?
Right.
And they're saying it's not because there's a lot of other approvals that have to happen in Wisconsin.
Right. That's part of their argument. Yeah.
Okay.
And our argument is basically when you have a government action that has a consequence, and the consequence here is Minnesota Power gets to build a new power plant, you have to do environmental review.
Mm-hmm. Hmm.
And the difficult question is, I mean, what Minnesota Power and the PUC both argued is that the PUC did not permit the plant. In other words, they didn't issue the construction permit or the discharge permit or whatever the permit would be for a plant like this that they would need. But plants need lots of permits. And our point was any permit that's required has as a prerequisite that you must do environmental review.
Mm-hmm.
Does that help? I tried. It's a hard one.
Yeah, I think so. Thanks for that. There's a comment here. Let's see. We helped stop the building of a coal plant in Sibley County in the 70s. Over the years, I've watched NSP fight environmentalists with ratepayer money. And then when environmentalists win, the utility claims credit. That's true sometimes. Although we're fine with that as long as we're winning together. Public utilities are supposed to be public trust, working with special benefits because of common interest. The laws are biased according to the view of economics that excludes externalities. That is a big issue that actually MCEA has worked on quite a bit. So back in the 90s, and Ellen, I don't know if you want to talk about the externalities law and that proceeding. There is a law in Minnesota that requires the PUC to determine what the external costs are of utility emissions. And so back in the 1990s, we were very involved in a proceeding before the Public Utilities Commission to set those values. And they were set pretty low at the time, particularly the value for greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide. And so about, 5-10 years ago now, we made a petition with our clients to the Public Utilities Commission to update those values. And we were successful at getting them updated, and they really reflect much better now the actual science on what the costs are of spewing both criteria pollutants, so like particulate matter and those typical pollutants, and also greenhouse gases. And that's been really important also in the IRPs. The externality values factor in. And it's kind of one of the examples of how MCEA works a little bit behind the scenes on issues that are somewhat obscure, but they're really important to the ultimate decision of whether the PUC is going to approve a gas plant or certainly a coal plant. They've been very helpful in that way. Yeah, Evan, what do you want?
Can I just jump in there too? I think that it illustrates how important the legislative work is that we do. All of what Kevin just described only came about because the legislature passed laws requiring the PUC to regulate these utilities in a certain way. So, when we're talking about, the 100% legislation or any of this other legislation, those are requirements that the legislature has the PUC implement to control and regulate these utilities. That, the balance is that they have this benefit of having a monopoly over certain areas of the state, that they get all of the rates. So in exchange, the legislature has the obligation to regulate them in the public interest. And we're fighting that all the time. We're fighting for.
And I would add something too.
Go ahead, Ellen.
We all have
something to say about
first,
this.
Ellen, that's why we're so excited to have Ellen as our new climate program director. But go for it, Ellen.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I've had my toes in a lot of different parts of state government, from the legislature to the PUC, et cetera. So that is true. I think the other important thing to say about the externalities rules that we have in place are they are very valuable in IRPs, because they're, when the PUC makes decisions about what resources the utilities are allowed to use for their next 15 years, what's their resource mix going to be? Is it going to include a coal plant or a fossil gas plant or wind and solar or whatever? Then they have to take into account those externality values. So it does, as you said, Kevin, it does make a big difference in the outcome of IRPs in terms of counting when the PUC evaluates what's the least cost alternative, which they often use as their metric, which I think they maybe rely on a little too much, but that's another legal topic and legislative topic, that they can't, so that you have to actually account for that cost in those decisions. But that's not the same thing as having a policy that actually charges polluters, fees or whatever it is for the use of emitting fossil fuels. So we don't have that. We don't have externalities covered in our actual policy framework at the state or national level. Some states do, a few of them do, and they're putting a price on carbon. And there's a lot of different approaches to doing that. But we don't have that mechanism in place where you actually have to pay dollars if you pollute.
That's a super important point.
Yes.
That's a big gap, and we got to figure out how to move policy in the right direction.
Yeah, and so related to that, Ellen, maybe you can talk a little bit about sort of what we're doing to prepare for the coming session. I know that we haven't solidified our agenda or anything, but maybe some of the ideas that are floating around, opportunities that you see on the horizon at the legislature.
Yeah, that's a good question. We're hoping that if the election goes a certain way, that we'll have a more favorable legislature in terms of clean energy and climate action. It's been a kind of a slog the last couple of years. And so that could change a lot of outcomes. And we have some really motivated legislators in place already. As you mentioned, the 100% campaign to try to pass 100% renewables or 100% clean energy legislation, which didn't move in the state Senate, but was passed in the state house, so, and the governor supports. So we have a lot of momentum there. We are talking about how we can contribute based on our expertise and kind of the legal expertise, the scientific expertise, and our relationships with different community activists, communities of color, and youth activists. I mean, all those different voices that need to be at the table to establish what are the best policies that we could try to push forward at the legislature. And so we don't have it all figured out, but I'll say one thing that we're definitely wanting to do for starters is to update the science, because right now, and as someone who helped to create the Next Generation Energy Act, which is Minnesota's law that calls for economy-wide greenhouse gas reduction, and we haven't met those targets, but that law has been in place since 2007. What we really need to do is update our requirements based on what science tells us we must do to avoid the worst impacts of climate change by the end of this century, and to try to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. So in order to do that now, you know, the current Next Generation Energy Act says, well, you should, I mean, it says there should be a 30% reduction economy-wide by 2025. We are not on track to meet that. It also says we should have an 80% reduction by 2050. We're not on track to meet that. But the scientists are saying, well, we actually need to cut carbon emissions across all sectors 45% at least by 2030 and be net zero by mid-century. And so I think it's important to look at ways that we can update that science and increase the urgency and ambition. State government and a lot of local governments in Minnesota follow those targets. And I think it would be really helpful to sort of just push a little harder on suggesting that we need the science to follow, to really be our guide for all of those, the state and cities that have really good intentions to cut carbon, that they need to push harder than those standards.
Yeah. It's sort of amazing how the science has developed over the last decade. You know, it's much clearer. So I think we have a really good basis for requesting that. Let's just go back to the case really quick, and then I think we're probably going to have to wrap up so people can go get their lunch. But there's a question here about what the next steps are, Evan. How long do we have to wait? Any thoughts?
Well, it's going to be some time. The Supreme Court usually takes a few months to make a decision. And
there is no deadline that they have to work under. We should make that clear. So,
right.
You know, it could be 3 or 4 months, or it could be 12 months. We don't really know.
It sounds like from the questions, though, that if they were to decide that MEPA did not apply, it sounds like it's going to go back to the Court of Appeals for a decision on the merits, meaning did Minnesota Power prove its case that they should get these agreements approved and build a power plant in Wisconsin.
Mm-hmm.
But in the meantime, we're going to be working with our clients like Fresh Energy and Sierra Club and some of the other groups on the IRP that Ellen mentioned that she was talking about for Excel. Minnesota Power is going to be filing their preferred future projection plan for the next 15 years in February of 2021. And we're going to be heavily involved in reviewing that and making sure that we're going to push them for the most progressive, least polluting alternatives that we can.
Great, good. Well, I hope that everybody got their questions answered, and I'll apologize already if I missed one. Evan,
can I just say one more thing about next steps? If we win, if they uphold the Court of Appeals decision, this will go back to the Public Utilities Commission. They will do environmental review, at least EAW, an environmental assessment worksheet, and then redo the decision, the main decision on the merits, because that's what the law requires. So it'll depend. It'll depend what the new commissioners think. We have different commissioners than we did then.
Yeah, good. So I want to thank everybody for joining us today. And again, thank you for supporting MCEA and our work. One thing that we've done quite a bit, because, you know, we're meeting obviously over Zoom all the time as a staff. And one thing that we sometimes do at the end of meetings is a chat storm where everybody types something into chat and then we all like hit go and you can see all the comments. So I was thinking we should do a chat storm for Evan to say, good job, Evan. You were awesome this morning. And thank you so much for all the work that you put into that case. I know that it was a lot. I witnessed it, a lot of it. But there was a lot going on also in your house when you were all alone late at night, probably.
True.
So if people want to type in chat their thanks to Evan or their way to go, let's go ahead and do that and send him off. And we'll send all of you off with just a big thank you. And we're so grateful for your support. So thanks for being with us today. I'm going to type mine in and then hit end and we'll be done. All right. Thanks, everybody.